This episode was sponsored by our patrons: Julie Gray, Bree Ames Smith, Robin Brown, Janelise Cannon, Jamie Lang, Maria Sanchez, Valerie Jacobson, Jill Harrigan, Heather McKinnon, Chantel Oliver, Caitlin McTaggart, Amalia Wild, and Rachel M. You can become a sponsor on Patreon to help make more episodes happen. Thank you so much for being our sponsors. We couldn't do this without you. Hi, Olivia.
Hi, Katie.
About 80 years ago, a little old Scottish lady named Aggie, who lived in a small house in Concord, Massachusetts, died without any heir. So ownership of the house transferred to her nearest relatives in Scotland, and so the house just sat empty and decayed and decayed. As you know, Concord, Massachusetts is known for its well-preserved grand colonial houses and like Victorian painted ladies. Mm-hmm. So this sad little 500 square foot decaying hovel was not so welcome.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's not okay.
It was slated for demolition in 2008, but some people were like, every house tells a story. What story might this one tell us? They look into it, and they find that the house itself didn't always sit there on Bedford Street in Concord, Massachusetts. It used to be out in what was called the Great Meadows. And in 1870, it was moved into town. I love this. They actually slid it on ice all the way from the Great Meadows to Bedford Street. But this house, out in the Great Meadows, was actually home to an African-American family who owned a 13-acre farm in the 1830s.
Oh, this house.
You recognize it? It's the Robbins House that we visited on the Lost Women of New England tour. And the women of this house campaigned for equal rights across America for basically all of their lives. They lived right at the same time and in the same town as the great transcendentalists Emerson, Hawthorne, Thoreau, the Alcotts of Little Women fame, of course. And all their homes, Emerson, Alcott, Hawthorne, Thoreau, those homes have been lovingly preserved along with all kinds of items, you know, like their beds and their desks, and even Thoreau's bean field has been lovingly cared for. So it is wonderful and relieving and right that at the 11th hour, this home was saved as well.
Thank goodness.
It's now home to a museum.
It's wonderful.
The Robbins House. And it turns out this humble home, of course, tells an amazing, sweeping tale of African-American history in the 1800s. And the story links transcendentalist Concord to the abolition of slavery and its aftermath in the South, to homesteading Kansas, and all the way to Pasadena, California. And we're going to see it all through the life of Ellen Garrison, who was essentially Rosa Parks 89 years before Rosa Parks.
Awesome.
I'm Katie Nelson.
And I'm Olivia Mickle.
And this is What's Her Name?
Fascinating women you've never heard of.
Allow me to reintroduce Jen Turner.
All right, so my name is Jen Turner.
Who we know from our The Gleaner episode, Judith Sargent Murray. Well, Jen Turner is now also the new director of the Robbins House.
The new executive director of the Robbins House, which is Concord's Museum of African American History. Like I said, it's a very small museum. 544 square feet.
So we begin with two siblings, Peter and his sister Susan, who inherited this house from their father, Caesar, who was a farmer.
He bought the house and about 13 acres of land for about $260 in 1822. He grew things like rye and cranberries. And the deed of the home stipulated that Peter and his family would live on this side of the home, and then Susan, his sister, and her family would live on the other side of the home.
And they live in two sides of the house. And the two sides of the house, it's like a duplex.
Yeah.
It tells two different stories. Stories about how can African Americans make it in 19th century America when people of their skin color are still being enslaved in the South.
So on Peter's side of the house, we talked about the ways in which African Americans gain social mobility. So Peter definitely gained social mobility through land ownership, through owning the farm. On this side of the museum, really had a different pathway to social mobility than Peter's family did. So this side of the museum is the side in which Peter's sister Susan lived with her husband, Jack Garrison, and their children. So Susan, she married Jack Garrison, who was actually formerly enslaved person from New Jersey who became self-emancipated. And Jack Garrison arrived in Concord in 1810, and even though he spent the rest of his life emancipated and free, he always lived with that threat that he might eventually be taken back into enslavement in New Jersey and then potentially elsewhere. But Jack Garrison married Susan in around 1812, and over the course of their marriage, they have 9 children, 5 of whom did not survive infancy. So they ended up having 4 children living to adulthood in Concord.
And it's their daughter, Ellen Garrison, that by luck and kismet and the good archivists at Tulane University, that we can really know some details about.
Ellen is often what we refer to as the Robbins House, as sort of the star of the show. So Ellen Garrison was born in 1823 in April, so she spent childhood and young adulthood in Concord. She ends up becoming, later on in life, both a teacher and a social justice activist. And we really think about the fact that a lot of her social justice activism really started in Concord. And it probably started most likely through the influence of her mother, Susan, because Susan, her mother, was actually the only African-American woman to be a founding member of the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. And we know that when the organization was founded in 1837, they held the second meeting of that organization in this house.
Ellen Garrison was 14 years old when they held that meeting of the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society in the house. I like to imagine that. I can remember being 14. I can remember groups of adults coming over to the house and just sort of being a fly on the wall and just witnessing, formative times, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Now, the Robbins House, again, doesn't sit on Bedford Street. It's been moved back out to the outskirts of town, actually right across the street from the Old North Bridge. I vividly remember running there as fast as I could. I was late. Gorgeous.
Yeah.
In 2011, it was actually moved from Bedford Street on a flatbed truck to its present site. We rent the land for $1 a year. So the town really helped to save the Robbins House. There were 3 Community Preservation Act grants that were given to the Robbins House to do a lot of the rehabilitation and renovation of the museum before it opened. And then it's within the confines of the national park as well. But it's a nice place that the people visit. I mean, people actually sort of accidentally come into the museum a lot because of the fact that we're so close to the Old North Bridge.
The Old North Bridge, being the place where the militiamen stood their ground against the British forces coming to seize their munitions, all American style. Tourists flock there by the millions today, and rightly so. It is both important in history and one of the most beautiful spots on Earth. So
the brick space here on either side of the museum is where the hearth would have been. The chimney, and with 2 fireplaces. And they also did probably have a loft, so that was probably bedroom space upstairs, because this is basically the one room on each side for the families. Yeah, they each had one room. And then they found some wallpaper as well, so they kept that. Some of these beams are original to the 1823 house, and then some of the floorboards on the other side are original. And we still don't have pipes or anything like that, so we're only open seasonally because of that. So they decided, there wasn't a need for heat. It gets very cold in here. Yeah, but when I came for my interview, I interviewed in this room, and they told me to layer because it was going to be cold, and it was.
That was part of the test.
Part of the test. If you could handle the cold, you got the job.
Wow.
So Ellen's mom is named Susan, as is her sister. And both girls, Ellen and Susan, they go to school in Concord.
As a young student, she and her siblings were one of the few African-American families who attended school regularly in Concord.
And in 1835, when Ellen was 11, Concord celebrated its bicentennial.
There was a bicentennial parade, and her mother forbid her to march in the parade. And she forbid her because she had been harassed the last time she had walked in a school parade in the community.
And her mom says, honey, no, there's too much potential for harassment. And I think that's really interesting and surprising. Maybe not so surprising, but Greater Boston was at the time like one of the centers for the abolitionist movement. And yet, even in Concord, Susan is telling her daughters, no, harassment was a common enough problem that she didn't want her daughters to march in a parade.
Well, often at the forefront of the movement is the biggest pushback.
I remember in our May Alcott episode learning about how Bronson Alcott, their father, how his school basically got shut down because he admitted...
integrated it.
Yeah, and the other parents, even though they were abolitionists, they still didn't like that. Well, Ellen, she marched in the parade anyway, and she did it because a classmate, Abba Prescott, promised to take her by the hand and walk with her.
She actually ends up walking that parade with Abba Prescott, who was 9 years old, and she was a white student at the school. And she and Ellen Garrison walk hand in hand in the bicentennial parade. And so in 1835, she essentially helps to desegregate that parade. We know about the parade through an obituary of Abba Prescott, who died young and who mentioned it in her obituary. This is Abba Prescott's obituary. So like I said, she died young. I think she died in her 20s. But it's interesting that this is one of the scenes that she wanted people to remember from her life. And it was the time that she took Ellen's hand and marched in the 1835 parade.
Ellen Garrison's direction was set. Like now, I think she's going to keep taking steps, literally, putting herself in the right time and the right place to nudge society in the right direction all her life. When she was 18, her mother died.
And in 1841, Susan, her mom, dies. And so Ellen actually ends up moving to Boston. And we know from several primary sources that we've been able to find over time that she was very active in the anti-slavery movement in Boston. And so what I'm passing around right now is a broadside that talks about a meeting attended by William Wells Brown, who's a well-known self-emancipated man who eventually becomes a well-known author in the time period, along with William Lloyd Garrison. And you can look at the bottom of the broadside and you can see Ellen's name as part of the committee that was planning the celebration. So she was definitely prominent in anti-slavery circles as well.
She was in Boston working away for about 20 years. And we know that the headquarters of Black Abolitionist Boston was the African Meeting House, a Baptist church, because even among abolitionists, as we said, segregation at church still prevailed.
Yeah.
So Ellen Garrison almost certainly became an essential element of that community. She got married at age 34 in 1857. We don't know much. We know she married a John W. Jackson, who was a free black gardener from Delaware. Fast forward a few years, and who should arrive in Boston bearing a letter of introduction from William Lloyd Garrison, but none other than Edmonia Lewis.
Yay!
From the Sculptor episode. By the way, Ellen Garrison, no relation to William Lloyd Garrison, but the same last name. But yeah, if you recall from our episode, The Sculptor, Edmonia Lewis had been kicked out of school at Oberlin. But Edmonia Lewis found a welcoming home in Boston, and I can't prove it, but I am utterly convinced that Ellen Garrison was among that community who welcomed Edmonia Lewis into town.
Of course she would have been.
Of course. And actually, it was that year, 1863, when Edmonia Lewis arrived. The Civil War has broken out. The Emancipation Proclamation has been declared. Like, in abolitionist circles, this is a huge, huge year. And it's also the year that at the African Meeting House, the Union Army recruited black soldiers for the first time. And the soldiers who went to sign up, they went to the African Meeting House there in Boston. In my mind, I put Ellen Garrison right there, pen in hand, helping people sign up. That May, 1863, Ellen and Edmonia, they would have been in the crowd that watched the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the first Black Union Regiment, march through Boston. And soon after, they learned about the battle at Fort Wagner that killed almost half of the regiment. And they absolutely would have been thinking and talking about it. Not only had all that happened, but black soldiers refused to accept any pay unless it was equal to that of white soldiers. So in the midst of all of that, Edmonia Lewis begins training to be a sculptor, of course. That's the way she's going to change the world. Ellen Garrison, on the other hand, she becomes a widow. We have no information. Of course, I was like, well, did her husband sign up for the regiment?
Oh, yeah.
So I actually searched the records of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, and I did find a John Jackson. But he was 22, and he survived. So it definitely wasn't him, because that would have made him 16 and her 34 when they got married.
Right.
Anyway, we have no idea what happened, but she listed herself as a widow in 1863.
There's plenty of other ways to die in 1863.
Plenty. Yes. So in the face of all of this, Ellen is thinking, I imagine, I can't enlist in the army. I can't, go out and physically fight a war for change. What can she do? And she may be asking herself, well, what do I really believe in, or what do we really need? She decides what we need is more and better education for Black people.
In the 1860s, she ends up deciding in the middle of Reconstruction that she wants to become a teacher.
So, on June 13th, 1863, she sends a letter.
13th June, 1863. Reverend S.S. Jocelyn. Sir, I have a great desire to go and labor among the freedmen of the South. I think it is our duty as a people to spend our lives trying to elevate our own race. Who can feel for us if we do not feel for ourselves? And who can feel the sympathy that we can who are identified with them? I should like to go as soon as possible, for I feel as though there is much work to be done, and I would like to do my share. I would have gone upon my own responsibility, but I am not able. And the times being so unsettled, I thought it would be safer for me to be employed by some society. I suppose I must tell you something of myself. I teach the common English, reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and grammar. Should there be an opportunity for me to be employed, will you please inform me what the salary would be and the particulars? I shall be ready to leave as soon as I can settle my present business. I have a select school, but I believe I can do more good among the freedmen. Please do write to me if there is any prospect, and you will much oblige me. Yours most respectfully, Ellen Garrison Jackson. Postscript. I was born in Concord, Massachusetts, and am a member of the Baptist Church on Joy Street, Boston.
And she goes to teach in Maryland. And these are the transcribed letters of Ellen Garrison, and they were found at Tulane University in a collection of material from the Freedmen's Bureau. And I think that if we didn't have these, it would be really difficult to sort of construct her life and to really talk about her impact within that social justice activism at the time.
11th April, 1865. Port Deposit, Maryland. Reverend S.S. Jocelyn. Dear friend, I have got the school in good working order, and the children are willing and anxious to learn. I have 31 scholars and expect more. My time has been very well occupied in the evening, as it is considered unsafe to go out. That is for colored people, for they are stoned and driven about at the pleasure of the rowdies. This seems somewhat strange to me, yet so it is. One man was badly injured last week and is now under the doctor's care. Please write word to Mr. Noyes about the books if you think that it will do any good. The want of school books is my greatest trouble. I have nothing more of interest, but shall write again after I get the books. Yours truly, Ellen Garrison Jackson.
She has a lot of interesting tidbits about being a teacher. I don't know how many of you are a teacher, but I am, and I know that even in the 1860s, she was complaining about the fact that there weren't enough supplies or books or materials for her students, so she was advocating for them in the 1860s.
April 1865, Port Deposit, Maryland. Reverend M.E. Strybey. Sir, I send the report of my labors the past month. The chief obstacle which I have to encounter is the inconvenience of the schoolroom. It has nothing convenient about it. No desks on which the scholars can write, no desk for me to keep my books in, and but one seat with a back, and these we have all borrowed. One thing is certain. My scholars like me, and therefore they regard what I tell them. My methods of punishment are various. Sometimes I have them stand up until they are pretty tired, and then I have a bench which I call the bad boys' seat. And sometimes I have to rap their knuckles, but I think that they can be easily governed. There is one thing which I should like to say, and that is that the people here are generally free people, but do not act as freed men. They are not like the northern free people. They are not yet accustomed to free laws and free speech and freedom. But they are anxious to learn, and hope to go to school when work here is not so brisk as it is now. It is a mistaken idea the people have here that they must take their children away after a few weeks' teaching and send them out to work. I have not been able to induce but one man to continue to send his son in spite of work, and he is so small he could do but little. Work, work, work is their motto, while mine is educate, educate, educate. Hoping that my report will prove satisfactory, I remain yours truly, Ellen Garrison Jackson. 13th April, 1866, Port Deposit, Maryland. Reverend S. Hunt. Dear friend, yours of the 3rd was received, and I will try to give you some faint idea of Port Deposit. I have generally walked through the streets unmolested. It is only occasionally that I have been beaten and stoned in the street by the boys. But my scholars are not so fortunate. They pelt them with missiles frequently so that the parents of some will not send them to school. I will narrate a little incident which befell me last 4th of July, which may give you some idea of their petty spite. I was walking with a friend on my way to a lecture to be delivered at Bathel Hall. We were walking very leisurely along when someone came up behind me and trod on my dress and at the same time angrily exclaimed, "I wish you would not take up all of the sidewalk. Somebody else wants to walk as well as you," which I thought to be very likely. Accordingly, I stepped to one side and politely told him he could pass by if he wished, waiting for him to do so. He then called me and told me he would not have any of my sass, and told me that he would slap me in the mouth. At this point, I thought it best to interfere, having a particular regard for my mouth. I told him in a very decided manner that he would not do it. He then passed on. I have found one thing about these people. If they attack you, be careful to stand your ground, and they will leave you. But if you run, they will follow. I think I should hardly have been able to walk the street for the boys if I had shown the least sign of fear. On the contrary, if they had to run from me. And now they generally keep a respectful distance and content themselves with saying something to annoy me as I pass, which I do not notice. They are very anxious to find out what my scholars are learning at school and question them. One foreman in the mill nearby, opposite, called one of my boys to him and began to question him in geography, but got out of his depth, for the boy had gotten ahead of him. I believe I have answered all of your questions, and I hope they will be satisfactory. Yours truly, Ellen Garrison Jackson.
So we do know that she was targeted by the fact that she was a teacher with the Freedmen's Bureau at the time. And she is in Maryland in 1866 when the Civil Rights Act is passed in Congress in April.
Here's what the Civil Rights Act of 1866 says. All persons born in the United States are citizens without distinction of race or color or previous condition of slavery.
And she and a fellow teacher, just a few weeks later, decided to test the legitimacy of the Civil Rights Act and whether or not it would actually be upheld in American society at the time.
9th May, 1866, Baltimore, Maryland. Reverend S. Hunt. Dear friend, this is the first time that I have felt it to be my duty to make any serious complaint, but an outrage has just occurred which demands attention. It was nothing less than the forcible ejection of myself and Miss Anderson from the ladies' sitting room at the depot of the Philadelphia-Baltimore-Washington Railroad in the city of Baltimore. We arrived at the depot a few minutes before 6 o'clock, took our seats in the ladies' room from which we were thrown out. We passed into the depot and I made my way to the ladies' room. I took my station near the table by the door. I had just time to take a glance at the occupants of the room when the female in charge came up to me and ordered me to leave the room, which of course I did not heed. As I considered that I was in the right place, she ordered me out several times and asked me if I was deaf, if I could not hear, and told me if I would not go, she would get someone to put me out. She then left the room, as I supposed, to put her threat in execution. Meantime, I stood waiting as patiently and silently as possible for her reinforcements to arrive. In fact, I did not speak to the woman who first insulted us, and did not speak to the man who thereafter he grasped my arm so tightly that I felt compelled to cry out, "Let me alone! Take your hands off me!" We were injured in our persons as well as our feelings, for it was with no gentle hand that we were assisted from that room, and I feel the effects of it still. After which I told him he would hear from me again. I recollected that he had pretended to be a police officer. I turned towards him, and looking him full in the face, inquired of him whether he really was a police officer. He very distinctly told me it was none of my business. I feel as though I ought to strive to maintain my rights. As long as our friends have passed a law for our protection, we ought to contend for our rights, and let our friends see that we appreciate their efforts on our behalf. I made up my mind to take the complaint to the SUPT of the Freedmen's Bureau General Standard, whose headquarters are at Baltimore. I did so in person. He said that it ought to be attended to. The general also told me that he would do all in his power. It will not benefit us merely as such, but it will be a stand for others. I feel anxious to have your opinion. Just at this time, it appears to me a question of great importance. It is different from the past. We can give evidence now. Yours truly, Ellen Garrison Jackson.
And the Freedmen's Bureau told her to go back to the train station and get witnesses who might then be able to appear in court for her. And so after just being forcibly ejected, she ends up going back into the train station to try to find witnesses. And ultimately, she decides to sue.
21st May, 1866, Baltimore, Maryland. Reverend S. Hunt. Dear friend, we went to Baltimore on Friday evening and presented ourselves at court on Saturday morning as requested. The case was not called. Our opponent's counsel consulted with ours and requested a compromise, which, proposition being unexpected by us, required consideration. We could not agree to compromise. The fact is, the case must be very much against them, or they would not want it disposed of in that way. The colored people of Baltimore came to our aid in a very unexpected manner. They said they would assist us with their money to continue the case, and by no means to give in, but test it, and find out whether we have civil rights or not. They said it concerned them all, and we have pledged ourselves to go through. Our case is a good one to decide the question, for we did not resist in any other way than by retaining our seats. We did not once lose sight of our position, but maintained our dignity. Our Baltimore friends came up to hear the trial. The courtroom was crowded. I had no idea of the sensation it would create, and nothing short of a question like this would justify me in making such a public spectacle of myself. It certainly requires a great degree of moral courage to act in this matter. It is no trifling subject. Whether successful or unsuccessful, we must stand firm to the last. I know there is danger, but the same kind Father who has protected me until this time, I believe will continue to do so unto the end. I feel that it is a good and glorious effort in which I am engaged. Our soldiers went forth with sword and bayonet to contend for right and justice. We could not do that. But we contend against outrage and oppression wherever we find it, firmly standing and giving away for the rudest shocks. Yours truly, Ellen Garrison Jackson.
She's one of the first African Americans in the United States to actually attempt desegregation of a public space in this time period. So it's an early test case, essentially, for the issue of civil rights during Reconstruction. Her case is ultimately dismissed. It was dismissed because at the time she didn't have a jury of her peers because she was African American and a woman. And so ultimately the case was thrown out of court, but the station master who had forcibly ejected her and injured her arm was fined. But that sort of legacy still exists today, even though a lot of people don't know her story. And so we really work hard at the Robbins House to try to tell that story. And we still have, I think, we're hoping that we'll be able to learn more about the court case as well.
Now, here's where things get fun. Jen Turner, in that moment, was hoping to find a legal scholar who could help them untangle the court case. Lo and behold,
What'sHerName Tours provides all necessary.
That's right. We're not just traveling adventurers.
We bring the experts to you.
Exactly. So among our ranks was Ellen Gross, the Ellen Gross of episode Shoutouts. Just the woman that they were hoping to find.
Yeah, we're hoping to maybe work with some legal scholars to try to really get into the specifics of the case, and the details. Ooh, excellent.
And here's me putting her completely on the spot.
Speculate. So I assume then, because it was under the Federal Civil Rights Act, that she did bring it in federal court.
Yes.
So,
I feel like it's destiny. Sharing the name Ellen.
Oh.
Ellen G.
Ellen
even.
G. Oh.
Yes. So Ellen immediately dug into it, on the spot even, sharing information by the end of the tour.
Yay, Google. My favorite legal research was that apparently Ellen's
Such as the possibility that Ellen Garrison's case was later cited as precedent in the Rosa Parks case.
Amazing!
Historic lawsuit.
I did not know that. That's interesting.
With that
Okay.
information, that would be closer in time to go back and look at a source document to get a cite to whatever.
That's really interesting. And it's ironic because we often call her like Concord's Rosa Parks because essentially she did what Rosa Parks did 90 years earlier. So that's fascinating because I wasn't aware of that.
And now, lucky us, we have the news from Ellen Gross.
Ooh.
Bless her soul. She read the 300-plus page documents of the Rosa Parks case, searching the entire thing for any references to Ellen Garrison, any references to that earlier case. She also found the court docket, which lists all of the documents that were filed in the case.
Wow.
So based on all of that, it appears that Ellen Garrison Jackson's earlier lawsuit was not legal precedent for the Rosa Parks lawsuit. But we actually know why, and it's quite interesting, is because her case was dismissed. So, there's not a legal,
right?
It wasn't a case.
They wouldn't want to invoke that.
So you couldn't cite a case that didn't happen as legal precedent for a case that's happening. But the reason that it was dismissed is also quite interesting. So as far as like the legal details about it, which I didn't know because I'm not a lawyer. So when Ellen Garrison sued, the defendant requested a jury trial. And it was in that moment that Ellen Garrison and her lawyers must have thought, well, will we get a jury of our peers. Will we get a fair trial? Will the jurors actually listen to the case?
Certainly not.
And so that's when they dismissed the case. But that doesn't mean they didn't learn a lot. So even though this isn't legal precedent for the Rosa Parks case, it is a major part of the whole civil rights movement in America of learning how they were going to legally push for the enforcement of their rights. They learned with the Ellen Garrison case that you shouldn't take a case to a jury.
Of white men.
Yes. So Ellen Gross tells us that one of the things that they learned was to avoid a jury trial. Don't sue for damages for your rights being infringed upon. You want to go for an injunction because then it won't involve a jury trial. And then you could actually, force the right thing to happen. So so many steps in the 89 years between this case and the Rosa Parks case. But it's not like nothing was happening in those 89 years. Like all of those years, they were taking steps and learning, so this isn't quite working. So we need a situation of this particular thing.
Yeah.
We need, So it was a really important legal lesson, although not cited as a legal precedent in the Rosa Parks case. Fascinating, right?
Yeah, which is, so important in the way that the Rosa Parks case was framed for many of us as children. I think the idea that she was just a tired lady who sat down on the spur of the moment.
Oh, right. And that everybody was fine with it until Rosa Parks wasn't fine with it.
Yeah, that this was just suddenly this feeble old lady.
One lady,
sat down
said,
and everything changed, which is, of course, hilarious nonsense.
Of course not.
And this was
so
decades of extremely systematic planning.
And Ellen Garrison's all over America for 100 years, more than 100 years leading up to what we call the civil rights movement of the 1960s. But here she is in the 1860s doing exactly the same thing. Pretty awesome.
And depressing, but also inspiring.
Ellen Gross says, regardless of whether she or her case is explicitly mentioned, what she did and the strength she showed in 1866 was nothing less than groundbreaking for the time.
Yay. Amen.
Thank you, Ellen Gross, for sharing your expertise with us.
Our listeners are the best.
In 1870, her teaching contract was ended because the program ran out of money. But she found work teaching for Quaker schools in North Carolina. And she taught there, apparently, for another 10 years.
Wow.
Then, in the 1880s, she follows the call west, joining the homesteading Westward Ho movement. And she actually became an exoduster. Have you heard of exodusters?
Exodusters?
I've heard of carpetbaggers. And
I've heard of
the
the something dusters, but I don't think it was exodusters.
No, so the exoduster combines the Exodus of Moses with going west to Kansas. So it's a large migration of African Americans, former slaves.
Wow.
Who go to Kansas to homestead the West. And there was a lot of government support for it. People could claim their 160 acres of land, famously made available magically by the Homestead Act, as seen so iconically in Far and Away with Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise.
Yes, that's what I was just thinking.
Yeah.
We just rewatched that. I don't remember any black people in Far and Away. Maybe there were.
Maybe not in Oklahoma.
Oh, yeah.
They were extra encouraged to go to Kansas because Kansas was a free state, not a slave state. Thanks to John Brown, a couple decades earlier, Kansas had really fought bitterly for its free state status.
Yeah.
And so free Black immigrants were particularly welcome, like as a point of pride.
And so she ends up for several years with the Exodusters. She passes her teacher's license in 1879.
See, there's a story that, all these stories that aren't part of the story, Black homesteaders, aren't in the movie.
Yeah. Maybe we don't really hear about it because it turns out Kansas is not really great for homesteading land.
That's why they encouraged the Black people to go to Kansas.
Well, they found out when they tried. They didn't know till people went and tried. And then, some people got lucky with really rich farmland and a lot of people did not. And, especially if it is kind of like in Far and Away. They're just grabbing this 160 acres and trying. Like our great-grandparents tried and utterly, completely failed. So in Kansas, most of the land was not actually good for homesteading or farming or, anything like that. So it was not the success or massive opportunity that many had hoped for. However, at least she did meet Harvey Clark, a widower with 4 children, and they got married.
She gets married. She marries a man named Harvey Clark, who was a homesteader who had several teenage children. So she ends up becoming a stepmom pretty late in life. And then in 1890, we think that she develops tuberculosis or some health issues. And so in 1890, Harvey Clark will sell the farm that they have in Kansas, and she moves to Pasadena. And she ends up in Pasadena, California, and she ends up essentially really becoming part of an egalitarian community in Pasadena, including Ruth and Owen Brown, who were the children of John Brown, who had formed this egalitarian commune in the Pasadena area.
And her sister, Susan, also ended up in California and moved in with her.
The last several years of their life together. So even though there's such a geographic distance, they're able to sort of maintain their family ties as well. And she dies 2 years later in 1892, having really spent most of her life working as a teacher and obviously working for the social justice issues that she felt were so important to her life and that we think really started here in Concord. She was originally buried in an unmarked grave, and then there was a group with the Altadena Historical Society that actually put in a headstone for Ellen about 2 years ago, on Juneteenth, yeah.
Her unmarked grave is so interesting because we generally take it to be either a sign of poverty or a sign that no one cared. And I think we can rule both of those out in this case. So I got thinking she did teach at Quaker schools for a full decade. And Quakers are intentionally buried in unmarked graves. Maybe it was a choice.
Yeah.
She absolutely lived a Quaker lifestyle as far as dedicate your life to doing good, to being humble, to just helping other people. She absolutely did that.
Maybe she's just like you. Didn't want anyone remembering her.
Yeah. Yep.
And we're here ruining her life, her death.
Yes. In the modern world, people are so alarmed by it, they put a headstone there to commemorate her. So interesting. What's your impression of her personality?
I mean, I think the fact that she walked back into that Baltimore train station really indicates how brave and courageous a person she was. And as a teacher, I just think that she had a lot of empathy and kindness and really wanted to see changes for African American society in the aftermath of the Civil War, because she definitely said at one point that she really wanted to elevate her race, to be really participants in American society in a way they hadn't been before the Civil War.
Some glad morning when the light was over, I'll fly away like a bird from prison by the floor. I'll fly away, fly away, fly away.
The thing that always strikes me about her is just the fact that at such a young age, she saw injustice, and rather than sitting back and letting society kind of dictate what her role was in society at the time, she fundamentally refused to do that. And I think that it's a great lesson for all of us when we see injustice, that we should act to the best of our ability to try to make the world a better place, because I think that was fundamentally what she wanted to do with her life and what she ended up doing.
Ellen Garrison's story, thanks to folks from Pasadena to Tulane to Concord, is becoming much more well-known. And last year, a short documentary about her was even filmed in Concord.
And there's actually a group out of Tufts called Half the History, and they do a lot of short films on different women's lives, and they're actually doing a short film on Ellen. And over Indigenous Peoples Day, they actually recreated the scene, the bicentennial parade scene. So people were dressed in costume, and my daughter participated. And so, yeah, it was really just amazing to see her story come to life. She's this amazing woman that not many people know about, but it's a joy to be able to talk about her as the director of the Robbins House.
I feel as though I ought to strive to maintain my rights. It will not benefit us merely as such, but it will be a stand for others. Just at this time, it appears to me a question of great importance. Yours truly, Ellen Garrison Jackson.
Special thanks to Jen Turner at the Robbins House Museum in Concord, Massachusetts. If you'd like to see virtual exhibits and a walking tour of Abolitionist Concord, head to our website, What'sHerNamePodcast.com. Special thanks also to Anika Bell, who voiced Ellen Garrison's letters, and Ellen Gross for all of her legal research and expertise. Music for this episode was provided by Recordings in the National Jukebox Collection at the Library of Congress, Late Night Feeler, Sir Cubworth, Amulets, Aaron Kenny, and the lyrics of the Song of the Abolitionist were written by William Lloyd Garrison and performed by the staff at History Alive Salem. Our intern is Katie Boucher, and I want to give a special shout out to everyone who stood there in the Robbins House with us on the Lost Women of New England tour. You can follow us on Instagram, X, and Facebook, where we post all kinds of additional content each week. Thank you so much for donating. Thanks for listening.